My name is Sarah, 32 years old. Exactly 6 days before the wedding. I stood frozen, staring at the phone screen my bridesmaid had just pushed toward me. It was a misdirected text. My own mother wasn't just planning to ruin my wedding at the altar. She had accepted $40,000 in cash to sell me to her best friend's son. Before I tell you how a soldier turned her wedding into a court-martial for treason, tell me where you are listening from, hit that subscribe button, and remember this. Sometimes the greatest enemy doesn't wear a uniform on the other side of the line. They wear a floral dress, smile, and call you daughter. Rachel Kim didn't knock. She had a spare key, and she used it like a master key to a crime scene. It was 11 p.m. The air in my kitchen was still, smelling faintly of the lemon floor cleaner I'd used to prep for a wedding that was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Rachel walked straight in, still in her navy blue nurse scrubs, smelling like hospital soap and the kind of exhaustion that only comes from a 12-hour night shift. She didn't say hello. She reached into her pocket, pulled out her iPhone, and slid it across the black granite countertop. The friction made a dry, screeching sound, like a razor blade on bone. "You need to read this, right now," she said. Her voice was thick, heavy. The blue light from the screen hit my face, ghostly and cold in the darkened kitchen. It was a group chat for the bridesmaids, a text from Carol Whitmore, a woman who treated money like a god and everyone else like her subjects. She had sent it to the wrong thread. "Everything ready for Saturday? Derek is nervous. The $40,000 was well worth it." I blinked. My eyes traced the words again. Derek, the 30-year-old mama's boy who still lived in a house Carol bought him. Then I saw the reply. It came from the contact saved in my phone as Mom. "Don't worry. Once Richard finishes the speech, she won't have a choice. She won't embarrass herself in front of 200 people." My nervous system just quit. Data overflow, error. My lungs felt like someone had poured 5 gallons of quick-dry cement down my throat. I grabbed the edge of the granite. My knuckles turned white, the skin stretching over the bone until it looked like it might tear. 3 weeks ago, my mother, Janet, had handed me a check for $20,000. She'd cried. She'd told me it was a peace offering, a gift to help with the down payment on the house Marcus and I wanted. I was a fool. I had been an Army intelligence officer for a decade, trained to spot a lie from a mile away. But I'd let a floral dress and a fake tear bypass my radar. It wasn't a gift. It was a down payment. My own mother had brokered a deal. $40,000, half up front, half on delivery. And the delivery was me. My knees gave out. I slid down the front of the kitchen cabinets, hitting the cold ceramic tile with a thud that echoed in the silence. I have spent months in Kandahar. I have felt the ground shake from mortar fire while lying in a dirt hole, watching the sky turn red. My heart rate never broke 90. I was a professional, a soldier. But right here, in my own kitchen, in my own home, I couldn't breathe. My stomach cramped so hard I thought I was going to lose my dinner right there on the floor. Then I heard the heavy thud of footsteps on the stairs. Marcus. He walked into the kitchen wearing gray sweats, shirtless, his chest broad and scarred from a life of hard work. He didn't scream. He didn't ask, "What's wrong?" because he could see me crumpled on the floor like a discarded rag. Rachel didn't say a word. She just pointed at the phone on the counter. Marcus sat down on the tile next to me. He didn't try to pull me up. He just wrapped an arm around me and pulled my head against his chest. His heartbeat was steady. Thump, 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 thump. It felt like a pile driver, permanent, unbreakable. "Breathe, Sarah," he whispered. His hand was rough, calloused from years on construction sites, rubbing circles into the back of my cotton army t-shirt. He reached up, grabbed the phone, and read the messages. I felt his jaw clench against the top of my head. I could hear the bone grind. "Cancel everything," I said. My voice was a wreck, guttural, broken. "Call the venue, call the caterers, cancel it all." Marcus put the phone down on the floor. He took my chin in his hand and forced me to look at him. There was no pity in his eyes. Just cold, hard steel. The kind of look a man gives you when he's about to hold the line or die trying. "No," he said. His voice was a low growl. "We are not canceling a damn thing. Saturday is our day. They don't get to take that from us." His words were like a bucket of ice water dumped over my head. The short-circuiting in my brain stopped. The shaking in my hands died down. The victim was gone. The officer was back. I stood up, my spine clicking into place, straight as a spear. I looked at the phone. I looked at the $20,000 gift, still sitting in my savings account. I looked at Marcus. My mother thought she was the one running this operation. She thought she could use my wedding as a stage for a hostile takeover. She thought she knew me. She didn't know a thing. I wasn't just a daughter. I was a major in United States Army intelligence. I had dismantled insurgent cells in 3 different time zones. If Janet Clark wanted a fight at the altar, she was going to get one. But it wouldn't be a wedding. It would be an execution. I walked over to the counter and picked up my laptop. "Rachel," I said, my voice as flat as a dial tone, "open that laptop. We need to find out where the rest of that money went." Operation Security was now active. The counteroffensive had begun. But as I stared into the dark backyard through the kitchen window, I couldn't help but wonder. Why? Why did she hate me this much? Why was my independence such a threat to her that she'd sell me like a piece of livestock? I closed my eyes, and the memories of 32 years of discipline started to flood back. I had to look at the map of how we got here before I could burn the whole thing down. I lay awake staring at the ceiling of our new home, the silence of the night pressing against my chest like a lead plate. My mind was a loop of those blue light texts. That betrayal? It wasn't some freak accident. It wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was the final, ugly bloom of a poison tree that had been growing for 32 years in a 2-story house exactly 11 miles away. The Clark residence was never a home. It was a fortress of manipulation. A tactical training ground where I learned that love was a currency and I was always broke. My father, Richard, was a ghost who wore a mail carrier's uniform. 31 years he spent walking the same streets, delivering other people's news while ignoring his own life. He had one real talent: vanishing into the drywall. Every time my mother launched into one of her calculated rages, Richard would just lift his newspaper higher. He'd hide behind the sports section or the local obituaries, the dry rustle of paper acting as his white flag. "Just listen to your mother, honey," he'd mutter, his voice muffled by the newsprint. He didn't want peace. He wanted silence. He'd throw me into a minefield every single time just to keep the claws off himself. He was a pawn who'd convinced himself he was a victim, when really he was just a coward who watched his daughter drown so he wouldn't get his shoes wet. And then there was Tessa, my 27-year-old sister, a human ornament. Tessa hadn't paid a bill in her life. She lived in a sleek downtown apartment Mom paid for. She drove a SUV Mom bought. She spent her days setting up ring lights and tripods, pouting for TikTok followers, selling a life she didn't earn to people she didn't know. To my mother, Tessa was the prize. She was the one who needed protecting. Janet, my mother, ruled that house with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove of fake martyrdom. Her favorite weapon was a sigh. A heavy, bone-weary sound followed by the same old refrain. "After all I've done for this family." That sentence was a noose. She used it to choke out any opinion that didn't match her script. I wasn't her daughter. I was a backup bank account, a damage control machine. Whenever Tessa got a DUI or blew her rent on a designer handbag, it was my phone that rang. I was the responsible one, the strong one, the one who could handle it. I joined the Army at 19. I didn't do it for the flag or some high-minded ideal. I did it to escape. I wanted my own bills. I wanted a life where the strings weren't tied to Janet Clark's fingers. I wanted to pay my own way out of that hellhole. I spent years in the Middle East. I remember the taste of sand. It stays in your teeth, gritty and bitter, no matter how much water you drink. I remember sleeping sitting up in rusted, rattling armored vehicles, the smell of diesel and stale sweat thick in the air. I saved every cent of my hazard pay. Every dollar I earned by dodging mortars and tracking insurgents was a brick in the wall I was building between me and them. One year, I sent home $5,000. Mom said the mortgage was tight. She cried on the phone about the bank and the stress. I didn't hesitate. I wired the money from a dusty tent in the desert. 2 weeks later, I saw a post on Tessa's page. She was posing next to her car, showing off a set of brand new custom rims. $5,000. My blood and sweat turned into chrome for a girl who'd never worked a Saturday in her life. Janet didn't even say thank you. When I made captain, she called me, not to congratulate me, not to ask if I was safe. She called to complain that I hadn't sent a birthday gift to Aunt Susan on time. It's embarrassing, Sarah. People think you don't care about your family. The truth is, Janet Clark was never proud of me. My independence, my rank, my house. Those weren't achievements. They were threats. A manipulator can't breathe if they don't have their hand on the dial of your life. In the military, I was an officer. I held the lives of soldiers in my hands. But when I stepped back into that house, I was stripped of my honor. I was expected to crawl back into my hole and play by her rules. She thinks she can use $40,000 to pull me back into that cage. She thinks she bought me. She thinks because she gave me life, she owns my soul. She's dead wrong. If you know what it feels like to be the strong one, while the people who are supposed to love you just bleed you dry, hit that like button. Subscribe so you don't miss the counterattack. And do me a favor, drop a comment below and just type the word "seen" if you've spent your life being the invisible child. Let's count how many of us are out here. I lay there in the dark, the memories turning into a cold, hard resolve. I thought about the first time I brought Marcus home. I remembered the look on my mother's face when she realized he was the one thing she couldn't control. The Cold War had been going on for 32 years, but that night, as I watched the shadows on the ceiling, I realized the first shot had already been fired. And I was the one holding the map. I've hidden my scars under a crisp uniform for 32 years. I've lived behind a firewall of military discipline, convinced that if I just stood straight enough, the world couldn't see the fractures Janet Clark left in my soul. Then came Marcus. He didn't care about the silver bars on my shoulders or the intel reports in my hand. He looked past the officer and saw a woman who just needed a place to set her heavy gear down. He was my shelter, my home base. But 4 years ago, on a cold Thanksgiving afternoon, I led that man straight into a minefield. Marcus showed up to the Clark house in a charcoal button-down, ironed so sharp it could cut paper. He brought a bottle of expensive red blend and a bouquet of lilies. He looked solid, real. A structural engineer who knew how to build things that lasted. My mother opened the door, her eyes scanning him like a customs agent looking for contraband. Her smile was a tactical mask, cold and thin. "Seems decent," she said. 2 words, capped with a shrug that made it clear, decent was just a polite word for trash. That night, while the smell of turkey and sage filled the air, Janet pulled me into the hallway. She didn't whisper. She spoke with a calculated volume, making sure the sound carried to where Marcus was sitting in the living room. "Are you sure, Sarah? With his salary, you could do so much better. You have a house? He has... what? A truck and a toolbox?" That was the opening shot. The start of a 4-year campaign of psychological sniper fire. The Clark family operates on a system of polite exclusion. It's death by 1,000 paper cuts. During the first Christmas, Janet forgot to set a place for Marcus. She claimed it was a family-only dinner, despite inviting 3 of her bridge club friends. Marcus didn't complain. He just kissed my forehead, went to a local diner, and waited for me to finish the charade. The following summer, at the annual BBQ, the disrespect turned blatant. Carol Whitmore was there with her son, Derek. Derek is 30, wears pastel polos, and has the backbone of a jellyfish. He spent his life waiting for Carol to buy him a personality. My mother sat me right next to him at the main table. "Marcus," she pointed him toward the rickety plastic table in the far corner of the yard, tucked away with the screaming toddlers and the family dog. There's just more room for the kids over there, Marcus, she chirped, her eyes glinting with malice. Tessa spent the whole afternoon rolling her eyes every time Marcus tried to talk about the bridge project he was managing. My father, Richard, just stared at the grill, flipping burgers with a hollow look in his eyes, refusing to acknowledge the man standing right in front of him. They used silence like a flaying knife, stripping Marcus of his dignity inch by inch. But Marcus was a steel shield. He took every bullet, every snub, and every backhanded compliment without flinching. He never snapped at me. He never made me choose. After those toxic dinners on the drive back to our world, he'd just reach over and grab my hand. His thumb would rub small circles over my knuckles, his skin rough and comforting. "Don't let them in your head, Sarah," he'd say. That was it. No drama, no demands. I watched him. I saw how he looked at me after a brutal training rotation, his large hands gently massaging my dislocated shoulder, his face etched with a quiet, fierce devotion. And it broke my heart. The contrast was a jagged pill to swallow. A stranger loved me more than the people who shared my blood ever could. I started setting up a security perimeter. I cut the visits. I stopped answering the calls that started with, "We're worried about you." I tried to quarantine the rot. Janet immediately pivoted. She started playing the martyr, her voice cracking over the phone during late-night calls. "You've changed so much since you met him. He's brainwashing you, Sarah. He's turning you against your own mother." Then came the river. Marcus took me down to the water on a Tuesday. No cameras, no crowds. Just the sound of the current and the smell of damp earth. He knelt in the mud, holding a ring that was small, simple, and solid. Like him. "I'm a man of few words, Sarah, but I'll stand between you and the wind for the rest of my life. Will you marry me?" I called my mother an hour later. I was still shaking with a kind of joy I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I expected something. A flicker of humanity. The line went dead quiet. 3 seconds of heavy, calculated silence. I could hear the rhythmic, shallow breathing of a woman who was already counting the cost. "I hope you've thought this through," she finally said, her voice as cold as a razor blade. "I hope you're ready for the life you're choosing. A life of struggle." She hung up. For 3 weeks, the silence from the Clark house was absolute. I thought I was free. I thought she'd finally given up. Then, the phone rang on a Tuesday night. Janet's voice was honey and silk, dripping with a terrifying sweetness. "I've been thinking, honey, I was wrong. Every mother wants her daughter to be happy. I want to help. I'm going to give you $20,000 for the wedding. Consider it a peace offering. Let's do this right." The Trojan horse had arrived at the gates. I was so hungry for her approval, so desperate for a scrap of maternal love, that I didn't see the soldiers hiding inside. I didn't see the $40,000 deal she'd already struck with Carol Whitmore. I didn't see the trap until the door clicked shut behind me. The money was in the account. The wedding was 6 days away. And the enemy was already inside the wire. The kitchen floor is a slab of ice. I am sitting on the cold ceramic tile, my back pressed against the lower cabinets, feeling the hard edge of the wood dig into my spine. Marcus is still there. His chest is a wall of heat against my ear, his heart thumping in that slow, steady rhythm that usually anchors me. But tonight, I'm drifting. I'm lost in the wreckage of my own making. I look at the black granite countertop, the way the dim light from the range hood reflects off the surface. I feel like a fool. A high-value asset who walked straight into a kill zone because the sniper had a familiar face. In the Army, I am the one people come to for clarity. I am a major in intelligence. I have spent thousands of hours staring at grainy satellite feeds until my eyes bled. I can look at a patch of dirt in a desert halfway across the world and tell you exactly where the insurgents buried their ammunition by the way the soil was disturbed. I knew how to read shadows. I knew how to spot a lie in the middle of a sandstorm. I was a professional. I was sharp. I was a goddamn expert in threat assessment. But when Janet Clark called me 3 weeks ago, I turned my own radar off. I chose to be a daughter instead of an officer. She'd used that honey-sweet voice, the one that always made me feel like I was 10 years old again, desperate for a crumb of her approval. She offered me $20,000. A peace offering, she said. A fresh start. Marcus had warned me. He stood right here in this kitchen, leaning his heavy frame against the sink, and told me that Janet didn't do favors without charging a high interest rate. He saw the hook. I only saw the bait. I wanted to believe in the Hallmark version of a mother. I wanted to believe the money was a bridge. It wasn't. It was a leash. I crawled into the trap like a starving dog looking for a scrap of meat, and I let her click the cage door shut. The gift hit my bank account on a Tuesday afternoon. By Thursday, the invasion was in full swing. Janet didn't ask for changes. She informed me of them. Suddenly, 30 strangers were added to my guest list. Business associates, she called them. People I had never met. People who didn't know my middle name, or how Marcus and I had struggled to save for our first home. They were just extras in a Janet Clark production. Then came the decor. I wanted navy blue, sharp, disciplined, respectful. Janet decided that was too military. She replaced it with a color she called dusty rose. It was a sickly, pale pink that looked like a diluted bruise. It made my stomach turn. But I took it. I clenched my teeth until my jaw ached, and I told myself it was just a color. I called it a peace tax. I was too busy with late-night briefings at the base and trying to fit into a white dress that felt like a straitjacket to fight her. It is just one day, I whispered to my reflection. Let her have her fun. Let it be over. But the seating chart was the real dagger, the master map of the battlefield. Janet insisted, no, she demanded, that Derek Whitmore sit in the third row. The third row. Prime real estate, VIP territory, right on the aisle. It was a tactical position. She wanted him right there, in my line of sight, so I would have to walk past his pouting, mama's boy face to get to the man I actually loved. Carol has bad knees, Sarah. She needs to be close to the exit, Mom lied. Her voice had been light, breezy, like she wasn't currently planting a bomb in the middle of my life. I knew it was a scam. Carol Whitmore plays tennis 3 times a week at the country club. Her knees are fine. She can run a mile in her sleep. But I folded. I opened the gates and I rolled out the red carpet for a coup. I was so caught up in the fantasy of being a good daughter that I didn't realize row 3 wasn't for a guest. It was a staging ground, a jump point for the woman who had bought my mother to execute a wedding day hit. I had handed them the keys to my perimeter and told them where the guards were sleeping. Rachel's iPhone is still lying on the counter. The screen has gone dark, but the ghost of those text messages is burned into my retinas. $20,000, a down payment. Carol didn't just want a seat at the table, she bought the whole damn show. My mother sold me for 40 grand. She put a price tag on my soul, and she let her best friend sign the check. The wetness on my cheeks is gone now. The tears didn't just stop. They evaporated in the heat of an anger so pure it felt like dry ice. The stomach cramps are over. There's only a flat, iron stillness in my gut. The kind of silence that comes right before the first artillery shell hits. I stood up. I didn't need Marcus to help me. I didn't need anyone to hold me. I brushed the dust off my knees and straightened my back. My army t-shirt, stained with sweat and grit from the day's training, felt like a suit of armor. I looked at Rachel. She was standing there in her scrubs, her face pale, waiting for me to shatter. I wasn't going to give her that. I wasn't going to give anyone that ever again. Rachel, I said. My voice was a dial tone, flat, mechanical, cold. Open that laptop. We are tracking every cent of this. I want to know exactly where the other half of that blood money is hiding. The officer was back on duty. Operation Security was live. I wasn't the prey anymore. I was the hunter. I looked out the kitchen window into the blackness of the yard, my reflection staring back at me with eyes that didn't belong to a daughter. They belonged to a soldier. And I was going to make sure Janet Clark learned exactly what happens when you try to sell a major in the United States Army. Marcus, I said, not looking away from the glass. Call Hector, tell him we need a cleanup crew, and tell him the target is family. Rachel Kim is a nurse, but tonight she's working like a damn hacker. She's sitting at my kitchen table, still in her wrinkled scrubs, the blue light of my laptop reflecting off her tired eyes. We're digging through the digital trash of the Clark family. It doesn't take long. Boomers like Carol Whitmore and my mother think they're clever, but they don't understand the footprints they leave in the snow of the internet. Carol is the worst kind of arrogant. She thinks she's untouchable, so she doesn't even bother to hide the trail. She left her Venmo transactions on public. Every single one. Rachel's fingers fly across the keys, tapping out a rhythm that sounds like a countdown. She stops. She leans in, her face inches from the screen. She points a jagged fingernail at 2 lines of text glowing in red. My stomach doesn't churn this time, it just turns to stone. March 15th of last year. A transfer of $25,000 from Carol Whitmore to Janet Clark. The memo line just says, wedding agreement. August 22nd, another $15,000. The math is simple. The math is brutal. $40,000. The contract for my life had been signed, sealed, and paid in full before I even knew I was a bride. I wasn't a daughter to them. I was a high-ticket item on a bill of sale. Janet didn't just sell me, she sold me on an installment plan. I stood up and walked to the junk drawer. I pulled out a heavy, stiff cardboard folder. My hands were steady. They didn't shake when I handled live ordnance in Iraq, and they weren't going to shake now. I started printing. I wanted the paper in my hands. I wanted the weight of the lies. The printer in the corner of the room started to scream, a high-pitched whine as it spat out page after page. Rachel grabbed the screenshots. I grabbed the bank records. I pulled out a red Sharpie, the kind I used to mark targets on a map. I worked with the cold, detached precision of a forensic pathologist. No anger, no screaming, just facts. I circled the dates. I circled the amounts. I cross-referenced the guest list my mother had forced on me with the names of Carol's business partners. It was a perfect match, a hostile takeover disguised as a family celebration. I slid the 5 pages into a thick, heavy brown envelope. It felt like a brick, a bomb with the pin pulled. I tucked it into my laptop bag and looked at Marcus. He was leaning against the doorframe, his face a shadow, a dry, hollow smirk on his lips. Detonator is set, I muttered. Good, he said. His voice was gravel. Make sure it hits the right target. It was 2 a.m. The house was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. I picked up my burner phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. Vega, the voice on the other end said. It was deep, rasping, and sounded like a man who hadn't slept since the late 90s. Hector Vega. My old CO. The man who taught me that family is the person who bleeds next to you, not the person who shares your name. Sir, it's Sarah, I said. My voice was a flat line. I have a security breach. It's internal. I need a cleanup crew at the Farragut Gardens on Saturday. 200 guests, high-profile targets. There was a long silence. I heard the clink of a glass hitting a table, a heavy sigh. Hector didn't ask for a backstory. He didn't ask if I was okay. He knew the tone of a soldier calling for fire support. Row 12, seat 3, Hector said. His voice was like a hammer hitting an anvil. That's where I'll be. You do what you gotta do, Major. I'll handle the trash. Nobody touches you. Nobody touches Marcus. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just finish it. The call ended in 45 seconds. That's what family sounds like. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I had to wear the mask. I had to play the part of the glowing, submissive bride. I went to the final rehearsal at the gardens. I stood on the grass under the white arbor while my mother hovered around me like a vulture. She smelled like expensive perfume and hairspray. It was cloying, suffocating. She reached out and adjusted the strap of my dress, her hand lingering on my shoulder. It was a possessive touch, a rancher checking the health of her cattle. I looked at her and I smiled. It was a perfect, practiced smile. The kind I used when I was lying to a high-value target in an interrogation room. You look so beautiful, honey, she whispered. This is exactly what you needed. You'll thank me for this one day. I didn't blink. I'm sure I will, Mom. That Friday night, at the pre-wedding dinner, I sat at the head table. I drank water, I watched the room. I saw Carol Whitmore laughing, her diamonds catching the light. I saw Derek. He was sitting across from me, picking at his salmon, refusing to look Marcus in the eye. He looked like a man who knew he was a thief but was too cowardly to stop. Marcus sat next to me, his hand resting heavy on my thigh under the table. He didn't say much, but I could feel the tension in his muscles. He was a coiled spring. I scanned the room one last time. I saw the seating chart. I saw the third row. I saw the trap they had set for me. They thought I was walking into a wedding. They thought they were going to humiliate Marcus and hand me over to the Whitmores like a trophy. They were wrong. I wasn't walking into a wedding. I was walking into an ambush, and I was the one who had the high ground. I looked at my mother one last time before we left. She was toasting Carol. She looked happy. She looked triumphant. She thought she'd won. The mask didn't slip. Not for a second. I just checked the time on my watch. 12 hours to go. The target was in sight. Saturday morning. Farragut Gardens was a sea of manicured grass and white folding chairs. The Georgia sun was already a hammer, beating down on the 200 guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a high-end catalog. To them, this was a wedding. To me, it was a tactical operation. The bridal suite felt like a bunker. The air was thick with the smell of expensive hairspray and the nervous sweat of bridesmaids. I sat in front of the mirror, my white wedding dress draped over me like a heavy suit of Kevlar. It was beautiful, sure, but it didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a uniform. The door clicked open. Janet Clark walked in. She looked perfect. Every hair was sprayed into submission. She smelled like Chanel No. 5 and lies. She didn't hug me. She didn't tell me I looked beautiful. She just walked over to the vanity and dropped a small white envelope on the table. "I wrote something for you, Sarah," she said. Her voice had that shaky, practiced tremor. The martyr's touch. "Read it later. It's from my heart." I didn't touch it. I knew exactly what was inside. Guilt. Reminders of sacrifice. A psychological hook designed to sink into my brain before I walked down that aisle. She turned and swept out of the room without another word. As soon as the door shut, Rachel Kim was at my side. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a thick, brown envelope. 5 pages of cold, hard evidence. She slid it into my white satin clutch, the fabric straining against the bulk of the paper. Rachel zipped it shut. Click. One in the chamber. The sound of a cello started to drift through the open windows. It was time. I stood up, my spine cracking into a straight line. I didn't feel like a bride. I felt like a soldier stepping out of the wire. I took the arm of the usher and stepped onto the lawn. The bright sun hit my eyes, making the white chairs look like a blur of light. My internal radar kicked in. It was a reflex I couldn't turn off. I scanned the terrain. Row 12, seat 3. Hector Vega was there. He sat with his legs crossed, looking like a man enjoying a quiet afternoon, but his eyes were sharp as razors. He locked onto me for a split second. A nod. The perimeter was secure. I kept my eyes moving. Row 3. Derek Whitmore was sweating. He sat there in a suit that cost more than my first car, mopping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He looked like a man waiting for a heart attack. To the right of the altar, Tessa was already in position. She had her phone held high, the little red dot on the screen blinking. She was live streaming. She was waiting for the show. She wanted to broadcast my fall to the world. And then there was Marcus. He stood at the end of the long white runner, hands folded in front of him. He looked like an oak tree in a field of weeds, steady, unbreakable. He was the only thing in this garden that was real. I reached the altar and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, and steady. He squeezed my fingers, and for a second, the noise of the crowd faded. But the ambush was already set. Before the minister could even open his mouth, my father stepped forward. Richard Clark wasn't supposed to speak yet. He was supposed to take his seat. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He walked to the microphone. The screech of the PA system cut through the air like a siren. "Excuse me," Richard said. He cleared his throat, his eyes darting everywhere except at me. If everyone could give me a moment, there are things that need to be said. The crowd went silent. 200 people held their breath. Richard started to read. It was a hit job, a scripted assassination of the man I loved. "We are here today, but our hearts are heavy," Richard muttered, his voice shaking. "As a father, you want the best for your child. You want safety. You want stability. Marcus, he doesn't have those things. Bad credit, no house, a history of instability. This marriage is a mistake that we, as a family, cannot support." Every word was a hollow point bullet. I felt the guests shifting. The whispers started, a low hum of judgment that rippled through the chairs like a wave. Marcus stood like a statue. He didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw locked tight. Richard stepped back, sweat pouring down his face. He looked like a man who had just committed a crime. Because he had. Then, the main event. Janet Clark stepped up. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the microphone from the stand with a sharp tug. "I'm doing this because I love you, Sarah," she wailed. She was playing the grieving mother, the saint trying to save her lost child. "I can't let you throw your life away, not after everything I've done for you." She turned, her face contorted with a fake, ugly grief, and pointed her finger directly at the third row. "We can still fix this, honey. We don't have to go through with this mess. Derek is right there. He's been waiting for you. A man who actually belongs in this family. A man who can take care of you." The garden turned into a vacuum. All the air was sucked out. 200 pairs of eyes were pinned on me. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for the tears, the screaming, the collapse. They thought they had me trapped in the middle of their stage. I looked at my mother. I looked at the finger she was still pointing at that coward in the third row. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I slowly reached down and unzipped my satin clutch. The sound of the zipper was the only thing I could hear. I reached inside and felt the rough, heavy texture of the brown envelope. I pulled it out. I didn't run. I didn't collapse into a puddle of white silk and broken dreams. I stood there, the Georgia heat baking the back of my neck, and I watched my mother. She was panting, her face twisted into a mask of frantic, ugly desperation, her fingers still shaking as she pointed toward that coward Derek in the third row. 200 people were staring at me, their faces a blur of pity and morbid curiosity. They wanted a show. They wanted to see the major break. I stepped forward, not like a bride, but like a commanding officer reclaiming a lost outpost. I reached out my right hand, palm up, inches from my father's chest. Richard looked at me, his eyes darting like a trapped rat's, his face slick with a greasy, terrified sweat. "The mic," I said. My voice wasn't a scream. It was a low, vibrating frequency that cut through the garden air. It was the voice that had commanded 100 Marines in the dust of the Middle East. It was the voice of authority. "Give it here, now." Richard flinched. He handed over the microphone like a subordinate surrendering his weapon after a failed mutiny. I took it, the cold metal casing grounding me. I turned my head slightly toward the right, where Tessa was standing with her phone held high. The red recording light was still blinking, capturing every second of my disgrace for her digital audience. "Keep that camera rolling, Tessa," I muttered into the mic, my voice echoing off the stone walls of the garden. "Your followers deserve to see how this story actually ends. Don't you dare cut the feed." The garden went dead quiet. You could hear the wind rustling the leaves of the oak trees and the distant hum of a lawnmower. I reached into the brown envelope I'd pulled from my clutch. The paper was stiff and heavy, lethal. I looked out at the crowd, my eyes scanning the rows until I found the ones who had started the whispers. "Let's correct the record," I said, my voice sharp and flat as a dial tone. My father was just forced to read a script, a hit job. So here are the facts. Marcus Thompson is a structural engineer, 11 years of experience. He builds bridges that don't fall down. He has zero debt. His credit score is an 820. A collective gasp rippled through the white chairs. In America, an 820 credit score is a badge of honor. It's the mark of a man who pays his bills and keeps his word. I looked at Richard. He was staring at his shoes, his collar soaked through with shame. He didn't have a trust fund. He didn't have a mother who bought his personality at a department store. I continued, my gaze shifting to Derek. He bought the truck he drives. He pays the mortgage on our home. He has never asked a single person in this garden for a dime. He's a man of honor, something some people in this family wouldn't recognize if it hit them in the face. Now came the heavy artillery. I pulled out the first screenshot, the Venmo trail. Now let's talk about love, I said, the irony dripping from my words like acid. My mother says she's doing this because she loves me, because she wants to save me. So, let's look at the price of that love. Let's see what Janet Clark thinks her daughter is worth. I held the paper high, the red Sharpie circles glowing like blood under the afternoon sun. On March 15th, Janet Clark's account received $25,000. The memo line? Wedding agreement. On August 22nd, another $15,000 dropped in. Total, $40,000 in cash. The silence in the garden wasn't just quiet anymore. It was a vacuum. I could hear Carol Whitmore's sharp, ragged intake of breath from 3 rows back. Janet's face went from a frantic red to a ghostly, translucent white. She looked like she was about to haunt her own body. 40 grand, I said, stepping to the very edge of the altar. I pointed my finger directly at the 3rd row. My arm was steady as a sniper's rifle. That's the down payment Carol Whitmore made to buy a seat for her son on this altar. She didn't want a guest pass. She wanted a title deed to my life, and my mother was the broker. The garden exploded, not with cheers, but with a roar of hushed, angry voices. The picture-perfect Clark family was melting away in real time. Guests were leaning away from Carol like she was a leper. I saw a woman in the 5th row cover her mouth in horror. The neighbors, the business associates, the bridge club friends, they were all witnesses now. Carol Whitmore clutched her chest, her face pale as a sheet. She looked like a corpse in a designer dress. Next to her, Derek was shrinking into his suit, his head ducked, trying to hide from the 200 pairs of eyes that were currently stabbing him from every direction. He looked like exactly what he was, a thief who'd been caught with his hand in the drawer. The tribunal was over. The verdict was in. If you've ever had to burn a bridge to save your own soul, hit that like button. If you're tired of people putting a price tag on your dignity, subscribe and stay tuned for the fallout. And do me a solid, drop a comment below and just type the word free if you finally decided that your life is not for sale. Let's see how many of us have walked away from the auction block. I looked at Marcus. He was still standing there, steady as an oak, a small grim smile playing on his lips. He wasn't the one who needed saving. I turned back to my mother. She was shaking, her mouth hanging open, no words left in her script. The ambush was over. But the execution? That was just getting started. I reached back into the envelope for the final page. The silence in Farragut Gardens didn't just break. It shattered like a windshield hit by a brick. 200 people were staring, their mouths agape, as the weight of that $40,000 contract settled over the white chairs. The air felt heavy, charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. I stood there, my white satin clutch empty, my hands at my sides. I was the eye of the storm. Calm, static, lethal. Janet Clark's perfect world was gone. It hadn't just cracked, it had turned to gray ash. She was gripping the edge of the wooden podium so hard her knuckles looked like white stones under her skin. Her eyes were wide, darting from row to row, looking for a friendly face, a hand to hold, or a script to follow. There were none. The neighbors she'd spent 30 years trying to impress were now looking at her like she was a stain on the sidewalk. She reached for the mic, her fingers trembling. She tried the old trick, the one she'd used to keep me in line since I was 5 years old. She squeezed out a tear. It was a pathetic, oily thing that tracked through her thick, expensive foundation. "I did this for your future, Sarah," she shrieked. Her voice cracked, hitting a high, desperate note that made the guests flinch. She looked at me, her mascara starting to run in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks. "How could you do this? How could you humiliate your own mother in front of all these people?" After everything I sacrificed for you. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't give her the satisfaction of a single tear. I just leaned into the microphone, my voice as flat as a dead man's pulse. You took $40,000 to sell me like a piece of livestock, I said. The words were stones, cold and heavy. And you're asking me about humiliation? You didn't sacrifice a thing, Janet. You just cashed a check. And now the transaction is void. To my left, Richard Clark looked like he'd been hit in the chest with a lead pipe. The mail carrier. The man who lived for the routine. For the first time in my life, he wasn't looking through me. He was looking at his wife. His face was a ghostly, translucent gray. He looked down at the crumpled, scripted speech in his hand, the one Janet had likely written for him, and his fingers opened. The paper fluttered to the grass like a wounded bird. You took money from her? Richard's voice was a ragged whisper, but in the dead air of the garden, it sounded like a shout. You took Carol's money to pay for this, to do this to our daughter? Janet didn't look at him. She couldn't. Her silence was a white flag. It was the final admission of guilt. Richard stared at her for a long, agonizing beat. Then he looked at Marcus. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe. Or just a deep, hollow shame. I should have asked, Richard muttered to the grass. I should have had the guts to ask. He didn't wait for an answer. He didn't look at the crowd. He just turned and walked off the back of the altar, his shoulders slumped, retreating toward the very last row. He was a ghost long before he left the stage. Down in the third row, the Alliance was screaming. Derek Whitmore couldn't take the heat. He was a 30-year-old boy who'd never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. The weight of 200 judging eyes was burning through his designer suit. He looked like a man who was about to be sick. He stood up so fast his wooden chair flipped backward. It hit the grass with a thud that sounded like a muffled gunshot. Derek, sit down, Carol hissed, her hand clawing at his sleeve. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She was watching her social standing evaporate in real time. No, Mom, Derek yelled, his voice cracking with a high-pitched cowardice. He shoved her hand away. This is sick. This is freaking sick. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at Marcus. He just turned and ran. He sprinted toward the parking lot, his silk tie flying over his shoulder, a thief running from a crime scene. Carol was left standing there alone, her mouth hanging open, clutching her pearls as if they could save her from the absolute ruin of her reputation. The deal was dead. The buyer had fled. I scanned the wreckage. My father was gone. My mother's partners were in full retreat. My sister, Tessa, had finally lowered her phone. Her face was pale, the red recording light on her screen finally dark. She looked at me, and for the first time in 27 years, she looked afraid. Janet stood alone on that altar. She looked small, shrunken. The iron-fisted ruler of the Clark house was nothing more than a lonely woman in a floral dress. I leaned into the mic one last time. I wanted everyone to hear the sound of the door closing. $40,000, I said, the words echoing off the garden walls. That's what you thought I was worth. You priced me out of your life, Janet. You sold the rights to my wedding, so you don't get a seat at the table. I'm going to love this man for free. And you aren't invited. I pointed my finger toward the exit. It was a cold, hard command. Get out. Janet Clark didn't go quietly. She went out like a cornered animal, her heels furrowing the expensive mulch of the Farragut Gardens as the security detail hauled her toward the iron gates. She was screeching about ingratitude and disrespect, her voice hitting those high, jagged notes that had shredded my nerves for 3 decades. But today, the sound just bounced off me. I was wearing armor. Tessa was already a blur, slipping through the service door like a shadow. And Richard? Richard was just gone. He had evaporated, leaving nothing behind but a crumpled piece of paper on the grass and a hollow space where a father was supposed to stand. I stood on that altar, the Georgia heat heavy on my shoulders. I felt the sweat trickling down my spine, trapped under the white silk of my dress. I looked out at 200 guests. They were frozen, stunned, waiting for me to have a breakdown, waiting for the bride to faint or flee. They expected a victim. They didn't know how to handle an officer in control. I adjusted the mic stand with a slow, deliberate click. "Is there anyone else who has something to say?" I asked. My voice was a low, gravelly rasp. No tremor, no apology. I saw a few people in the back rows look down at their laps. Or can I finally get married now? The silence held for a heartbeat. Then, from row 12, seat 3, a sound broke through the humid air. Hector Vega stood up. He didn't smile. He just brought his hands together. Clap, clap, clap. A slow, rhythmic cadence that sounded like boots hitting pavement. Then Rachel started. Then the whole place erupted. It wasn't the polite golf clap noise of a wedding. It was a roar. A wall of sound that felt like a pressure washer blasting the stench of my mother's lies right out of the garden. I turned to Marcus. He hadn't moved an inch since the firing started. He was standing there, his shoulders broad and steady, a faint, proud smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He looked at me like he was seeing me for the very first time. I reached out and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused from years of real work, and it was the warmest thing I had ever felt. The minister was shaking, his prayer book rattling in his hands. He looked at us, his eyes wide. "The vows?" he stammered. I didn't need a script. I didn't need a poem about soulmates. I looked Marcus dead in the eye. "I choose you," I said. My voice carried across the lawn, sharp as a razor. "I'm not choosing you because my family gave their blessing. I'm choosing you because when the walls came down, you didn't run for cover. You stood in the gap. You took the fire so I could find my footing. From here on out, I'm your perimeter. Your safe zone. No one gets through me to get to you. Ever." Marcus squeezed my fingers, his grip tight enough to bruise. "And I am not going anywhere, Sarah," he whispered. "The fight is over. We won." The reception was a blur of yellow light and the smell of cedar. We moved to a ballroom in a hotel downtown. It was old school, heavy drapes, polished wood. The kind of place Janet would have hated because it wasn't trendy enough. But for us, it was a fortress. The first thing I saw when we walked in was the head table, the VIP section. There were 4 chairs sitting empty right in the middle of the room. 3 for the Clarks, 1 for Carol Whitmore. The hotel manager hurried over, his face flushed with worry. "Major, we can remove those right away," he offered, reaching for the back of one of the chairs. "We can rearrange the seating so it does not look so vacant." "Leave them," I said. I pulled out a chair and sat down next to Marcus. "They are not vacant, they are proof." Those chairs were scars, jagged, ugly reminders of what it cost to be free. But they were clean scars. Searing the rot out of my life had been a surgical strike, and I wanted the world to see the result. The air in that room felt different. It was lighter. The whispers weren't about my unstable fiancé anymore. They were about the woman who had the guts to fire her own mother at the altar. The neighbors and the bridge club crowd were still there, but they were quiet now, respectful. They realized they were in a room with people they could not buy. Hector Vega walked up to the table. He didn't have a tuxedo. He was wearing a charcoal suit that looked like he had bought it in the 90s, but he wore it like it was dress blues. He raised a glass of champagne, the bubbles catching the golden light of the chandeliers. "To the Major," Hector said, his voice a deep rasp that commanded the room. "Being a soldier isn't about the uniform. It's about knowing which hill to die on, and which one to take. You took the hill today, Sarah. Good work." I clinked my glass against his. The sound of the crystal was sharp and clear. Later that night, the crowd thinned out. The heavy bass of the dance music drifted away, replaced by a slow, easy jazz tune. Marcus pulled me onto the floor. I kicked off my heels and stood on the cold wood, my head resting against the solid warmth of his chest. I could smell the faint scent of his cologne and the starch of his shirt. I closed my eyes and let him lead. For 32 years, I had been walking through a minefield. Every step I took was calculated. Every word I spoke was checked for traps. I had been a daughter, a sister, a puppet. But as we moved to the music, I felt the weight finally drop. The perimeter was established. The intruders were neutralized. I was finally off the clock. We got back to the hotel suite around 2 a.m. The room was silent, the city lights of Savannah glowing through the window. Marcus went into the bathroom to start the shower. I sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, still in my dress. I reached for the white satin clutch sitting on the nightstand. I pulled out the envelope. The one Janet had dropped on the vanity like a parting shot. The one she said was from her heart. I stared at the white paper. My thumb traced the expensive embossed seal on the back. I felt a cold chill settle in the pit of my stomach. I knew Janet. She did not lose. She just retreated to regroup. I ripped the envelope open. The adrenaline finally ebbed away in the quiet of the Hilton suite. It was 2 a.m. The city lights of Savannah were just a distant, electric blur through the floor-to-ceiling glass. I sat on the edge of the bed, the weight of the day pressing into my shoulders like a heavy rucksack. I took a breath. A real one. No armor, no radar, just me. I reached into my satin clutch and pulled out that white envelope. The paper was expensive, heavy, and smelled like the perfume Janet Clark used to mask the rot of her soul. I tore the seal. The sound of the paper ripping was the only thing in the room. I spread the 2 pages out on the crisp white duvet. The handwriting was sharp, slanted, a jagged fence of ink. I read the first page. It was a greatest hits album of her manipulation. You are throwing away your legacy. You are breaking this family apart for a man who will never understand our world. I almost laughed. It was the same tired script she'd been running for 30 years. But then I reached the end of the second page. The handwriting changed. It got smaller, crowded, desperate. I'm afraid, Sarah, she'd written. I'm afraid that I will lose you. I'm afraid he will take you away to a place where I can no longer reach you. Where I can no longer see you. Where I no longer have a say. I read those 3 lines 3 times. I sat there in the silence and I understood. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about Derek or the Whitmores. It was about the terror of a woman who viewed her daughter as an extension of her own skin. She wasn't losing a child. She was losing a piece of property she couldn't replace. But understanding a parasite doesn't mean you let it keep feeding. On this side of the line, no fear, no matter how deep, gives a mother the right to auction off her daughter's life. I didn't burn the letter. I folded it back up and put it in the nightstand drawer. A record of the final transmission before the signal went dead. 6 months have passed since the garden went quiet. The cleanup of the battlefield was absolute. I established a no-contact protocol that would make a bunker look accessible. The old Clark empire is a smoking ruin. Tessa had to delete every social media account she owned. The video she filmed, the one she thought would be my public execution, backfired. It went viral. But the world didn't see a rebellious daughter. They saw a family of sharks trying to eat one of their own. She moved 2 states away just to stop the people at the grocery store from staring at her. The alliance between Janet and Carol disintegrated into a mess of legal threats and screaming matches. They are currently suing each other over that $40,000. A fitting end. 2 vultures fighting over the scraps of a dead deal. As for Richard, my father finally found a spark of something that resembled a spine. Last month, a handwritten note arrived at my base. Just 1 sentence. I am sorry I did not have the courage to ask first. I called him. The call lasted exactly 15 minutes. We didn't talk about the wedding. We didn't talk about Janet. We talked about the tomato plants he's growing in Tennessee and how the humidity was finally breaking. It was a start. A small, cautious bridge built over a canyon of silence. It is Sunday morning now. Our new house in the suburbs of Virginia smells like roasted coffee and the sharp, clean scent of fresh eggshell white paint. The sun is streaming through the kitchen window, hitting the hardwood floors. Marcus is sitting on the rug in what will be the nursery, surrounded by a pile of oak boards and a bag of hardware. He's putting together a crib. He's taking his time, measuring twice, tightening every bolt until it's rock solid. He doesn't need to look up to know I'm watching him. I am a major now. The promotion came through last week. I'm standing here in my old college sweatshirt, leaning against the door frame. I have a piece of thermal paper in my hand, an ultrasound. I look at the grainy image and then I look at Marcus. The anger is gone. Hatred takes too much fuel, and I need all my energy for what's coming next. I've officially closed the intelligence file on the Clark family. It's archived, out of sight. I'm not closing the door on my father forever, but the security check remains in place. The rules are simple. If you want to be a part of this new world, you leave the weapons at the gate. You walk in with clean hands, or you don't walk in at all. I am building a perimeter that no narcissist can penetrate. I am ending the cycle. Major Sara Clark once had a price tag of $40,000 pinned to her back. But out here on the front lines of my own life, I've reclaimed the deed. If you are listening to this and you feel like you are being held hostage in a toxic outpost called family, remember this. Blood is not a lifetime sentence of abuse. You have the right to cut out the rot. It hurts. It leaves a scar. But a scar is just proof that you survived the hit. Establish your perimeter. Protect your peace. If this story gave you the strength to stand up, hit that like button. Share it with someone who is still hiding in the bunker. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a briefing. And do me one last favor, drop a comment below and type the word, mine. Because your life belongs to you, not them. The operation is complete, the target is safe, the war is over. I walked into the nursery and sat down on the floor next to Marcus. He reached over and squeezed my hand. His skin was rough, his grip was steady. We are the architects now. And we are building something that will never fall down.